morning. This is It's Sensitive with Alex
and Ellie.
And we're here to taco. It's Monday, not Tuesday. Talk about neurodivergence. Ellie is my roommate and friend, and she has a lot of experience with neurodivergence. Just as a general kind of definition, neurodivergent is a non-medical term that describes people whose brains develop or work differently for some reason. So this could be a person has different strengths and struggles from people whose brains develop or work more typically, which is called neurotypical. And for some people who are neurodivergent, they may have medical conditions. And that's the Cleveland Clinic definition. Most people probably know neurodivergence. It's such a hard word to say.
Sorry.
As like autism and ADHD, and similar conditions where your brain just works differently. Today we're going to talk about ADHD, and Ellie has personal experience with them.
I personally have ADHD.
And I think Ellie's perspective is super unique because she is an adult and she got diagnosed as an adult with ADHD, right?
Yeah, that's correct. And I think as we're getting more into more research and there's more, we're laughing.
I think the cat's in a box.
Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, sorry guys. This is a authentic podcast, which means we're laughing about cats in boxes. All right. I apologize.
You can't interrupt my thought process because the thought just disappears, aka having ADHD. But yeah, I think as more research comes out and there's more talk about ADHD in adults, more people get diagnosed, and that's how I personally became aware that I had ADHD and got diagnosed, and it changed my life. And I think for me personally, it is very important to talk about it and to make people aware that sometimes their struggles are not because they are lazy or scatterbrained or they're not good enough, but it's because their brains just work differently. And I think this is something that I try to talk to parents as well. I think sometimes they're afraid of that label, but that label is what really helped me get to know myself and really changed my life for the better. Really made me understand that it wasn't me that there was something wrong with, but I just wasn't fitting into that square hole of corporate America and other places.
Yeah, I think that's a great call out because we were joking earlier with brains. Like, there's a lot of pieces of society that were round pegs or triangle pegs getting shoved into a square hole that is everybody else, whether that's neurotypical, whether that's remote work and working in office, whatever that may be. I think there's been more attention on it lately because of COVID-19 and how our workforce changed drastically. But I do think not only neurodivergence, but mental health was a little bit more in the spotlight because with everybody being at home, we had to really assess who we are as people and how we work, right? So how long ago would you say you were officially diagnosed with ADHD?
About 2.5 years ago. It was during pandemic, and pandemic is what made me realize this was happening. Actually, TikTok was what made me realize I had, or what made me want to explore this. I got, as everybody else during pandemic, I got on TikTok and I started seeing adult ADHD videos, and they really fit. Everything really fit for the first time, because I've previously been diagnosed with anxiety and depression. one thing to understand about ADHD is that it has lots of comorbidities, and especially for undiagnosed adults, we often struggle to the point of developing anxiety and struggling with depression. And but I those things never fully explain to what I was experiencing. And I remember this one time I was at the therapist's office and I was having this meltdown. And looking back, it was a very typical, overwhelmed, neurodivergent person meltdown. And I remember looking at his face, and he had this look of concern on his face. And I will never forget. Concerning a therapist is a different kind of, wow, this is this bad, Ellie. But looking back now, I mean, looking at those videos, like everything fit, everything was like, yeah, this is me. So I went to my primary care and I said, hey, I want to go talk to somebody. Took me a really long time and lots of money to find somebody who would diagnose an adult. It was 3 sessions. It was $1,300 and
Wow.
out of pocket, no insurance. And it was worth every penny, honestly, because once I had the concrete yes, then as a true ADHD person, that I dove into research, and I tried to read books and find out everything there was, any research there was about being an adult with ADHD, and implemented in my life. And wow, it all of a sudden, lots of things made sense.
Yeah, I'm curious about that, especially, well, first of all, there's a joke that goes around that I get along with a lot of ADHDers, and I keep learning that my friends or people I've dated have ADHD. And one of my friends is actually like, "Are you sure you don't have ADHD? Because you understand people with ADHD way too well." But with that being said, I think I am curious. I know a lot because of my friends, but not everybody listening to the podcast may not. So I'm kind of curious, what was life like before medication, and what was life after medication or the diagnosis in general? Maybe like, what were your thought processes? What was difficult? And what became easier with medication or, having that diagnosis?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to say, in my 20s, I used to always say I'd never take medication. And my opinion changed on it when I had to go on antidepressants. But getting on Adderall felt different, right? It's a controlled substance. It felt scary. And I completely changed my opinion on it. Medication is a tool. It's one of the tools in your toolbox. It won't fix everything, right? It won't, I don't take Adderall in the morning and magically I'm now a neurotypical person. It allows me to exist in a neurotypical world and use other tools to thrive. So there are 2 main types of ADHD, and most people are a combination of 2, but it's the inattentive and hyperactive. Most people with the inattentive type have harder time getting diagnosed, because I was never a child that was bouncing off the walls, or adults that was just like bouncy and full of energy. Everything happens in my head. And so I was suffering in silence for a very long time. And I felt, for lack of a better word, crazy. My thoughts, my brain is extremely busy. I have multiple thoughts going on at the same time. And that made it really hard to exist in places where I was bored, like aka corporate America. My last job was for a big corporation, for lack of a better word, boring. So for me to have to sit at the desk doing boring tasks while my brain was screaming 17 different things was extremely hard. Also, neurodivergent brain is not good at prioritizing. So a neurotypical person will hear all of the things going on around them, but their brain will automatically select the conversation they're having as their priority, and everything else is sort of fading into background. Neurodivergent brain thinks everything is a priority, right? Everything that I'm hearing around me, if there's 7 conversations, my brain is taking them all in.
Yeah.
And then I have to focus harder on the conversation that's going on, resulting in fatigue. It's,
Sure.
when you have to work that hard to have a conversation, you're tired more quickly. So not only did I think, oh my gosh, I can't pay attention and I'm so scatterbrained, I also thought I'm lazy because I would come home and I would be exhausted.
Oh, I bet.
And I used to call them my little meltdowns, but about every 6 months I would have a meltdown. I would literally have a toddler meltdown. I remember working in a restaurant, and one day it was just too much, so I took a plate full of food and chucked it against the wall and walked outside to the parking lot. And I didn't understand why. It would be at the point where I could not control my nervous system. Looking back, I realized it was just my nervous system was overstimulated. And so being diagnosed, not only am I able to verbalize that and say to somebody, I'm sorry, we're having this conversation, but there's too many other stimuli going on around me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm paying attention. The reason I'm not looking at you is not because I'm not paying attention, but I can either make eye contact or I can listen to you. I can do both.
Sure.
But also I'm able to listen to my body and to feel when I'm getting to that point of overstimulation. And I can say, okay, right now I need to go sit in my room and calm down my nervous system so I don't go into that overdrive.
Yeah.
And being aware of that and having the tools to do something about it, those 2 things alone drastically changed my life. Because now, instead of, wondering, why am I like this? Why is this happening to me? Why can I not help it? And trying to force through that, I can take a step back and say, I know why I'm like this. I know what is happening. And instead of charging through
Sure.
with my stubbornness, I can say I need to take a step back.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good summary. And a couple things stood out to me. First of all, chucking a plate at a wall. I think we've all wanted to do that, whether we're neurotypical or neurodivergent. I don't recommend it, but sometimes you just have those days.
It's a funny story,
But I do think what stood out to me was the overstimulation, right? I've been dealing with, and we've talked about mental health a lot on this podcast, post-traumatic stress disorder and dealing with emotions that I typically didn't deal with in the past. And I get overstimulated in different ways. And I've had to find what works for me to kind of calm down, and it's different than what works for you. And I've noticed living with you, you spend a lot of time in your room and you're completely content with that. And I respect that and admire that you can recognize that in yourself and like give yourself that space to calm down and just chill out. Because I think in today's world, or at least in the American culture, we're big on like busy, go, performance and productivity 100% of the time. And that's just not how human bodies work, right? I'm actually taking a neuropsych class right now, and we were just reading about the brain and nervous system and stuff like that. And our nervous system isn't built to be engaged 24/7, whether that's, electronic devices or work or whatever. But when you're neurodivergent, how you get overstimulated might be different than somebody who's neurotypical, right? And that's what I heard from that. The other thing too, I think, is you called out kind of a little bit ago that medication is a tool in your toolbox and not the only thing that you use to help manage your ADHD. And it sounds like one of your tools is kind of relaxing your nervous system and finding space for yourself. Would you say that's accurate?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think, especially for, I mean, for anybody, right? But especially for neurodivergent people, our nervous system tends to go into overdrive, and there are things we can do to calm it down.
Sure.
And it is important to do that because then meltdowns are non-existent or much rarer than they were previously. And also, it just in general, you shouldn't live in that state of nervous system overdrive.
Sure.
So taking that time to sit in a corner and take a breath is really important. I'm a first generation immigrant. The bootstrap culture was definitely something I was really into in my 20s, and I still am a little bit of a, I like to be busy, I like to do stuff, I pride myself on my work, but at the same time, I understand that for me to give, to live my life the way I want to live it, and to be able to give my 100% at work, I have to sometimes go in my room and like wrap myself in blanket and listen to my podcast so I don't hear anything else. Like it's an important part of being able to do my job. I work with people every day, and I like to be on. I'm an animated person, and for that to happen, I need to come home and sit in the corner for a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, the other thing I was thinking about is you mentioned corporate America, and I come from a background with corporate America as well. And I was just talking with a friend this past weekend about how there are programs for like autism at work, and there's a lot of, I feel like, are a lot more programs that are there to help people with autism or who are autistic because traditionally autistic people have had a hard time just getting into the workforce in general. And that's amazing. And I'm so happy to hear that. And I'm seeing people with autism like be in the workplace and be able to work alongside neurotypical people. But I do think ADHD is one of those under highlighted neurodivergences because I don't see ADHD at work programs or even conversations around like how ADHD can be difficult in the workplace. And I think you had said a phrase about it's not a superpower, but it's not
it's not a disability.
Yeah.
And under the American Disability Act, ADHD is actually qualified as a disability, and you are able to get concessions theoretically, right? Everything, like according to law, you can ask your employer to make accommodations for your ADHD. But I think it's hard, and I think the one thing that is, or that I at least perceive as a stumbling block, is the fact that we're not talking about ADHD and adults with ADHD quite enough. And for people with inattentive type of ADHD, I don't think many people will look at me and realize I have ADHD until I say something. And that sometimes leads people to believe that nothing is wrong with you. And I'm a big believer that nothing is wrong with me. I just sometimes need different things that neurotypical people need. And that is okay. I think the conversation about not every one of your employees is the same and not every one of your employees needs the same things should be normalized in corporate America. I think
absolutely
it's really is this dystopia where we all should look and work and do the same things. And even when there are conversations about, what can we do for our neurodivergent coworkers, I think quite often it ends there. It ends with that conversation. And then it's back to, oh, you're not making enough eye contact. You're making too much eye contact. Why, why are you fidgeting? Why can you sit still? Why, and it's, if we're going to have those conversations, that we need to understand that there are changes that should be made, and there should, eye contact, if I can go on the soapbox, eye contact is one of those things that I, as a neurodivergent person, struggle with, have always struggled with, and will never understand. And neurotypical people, for some reason, think eye contact is the single most important thing you can do in a conversation. And I would like, really, for anybody who is listening, next time you're talking to somebody who is not looking at you, but seems otherwise engaged, think about why that might be. Because quite often I come across people who are very turned off by that. And I have said to people I worked with before, I can either look at you or I can listen to you. I cannot do both. And it seems to completely catch them by surprise, because neurotypical people naturally know how much eye contact to make. I don't, and lots of us don't. It's not always, when people don't look at you, it's not always malicious. When people do stuff differently than you do, try to give them benefit of the doubt. It's not because we don't want to listen to you. It's not because we're necessarily distracted. We're more distracted when we're listening, and we also have to think about, oh, what is the right amount of eye contact now? Am I looking at them too much? Am I staring too intently? Am I not looking at them enough? That is more distracting to us.
Yeah, you're definitely not the basilisk of Harry Potter, and we're going to turn to stone if we look at you too much. As a matter of fact, as you were saying that, I noticed literally Ellie and I are sitting across from a table from each other, the microphone's between us, and Ellie's, looking down because I can tell she's focusing, because we both have headsets on that we can kind of hear what's being said through the microphone. And for me, it's very difficult, but I'm like staring Ellie down because I'm trying to focus on what she's saying. But in that same vein, like, I'm not offended that Ellie's not looking at me, because I understand, like, when you're focusing, that's not maybe something you can do. And I wholeheartedly agree with that statement, because there's more than just that reason why somebody may not be able to make eye contact. I know, dealing with PTSD, I've had a therapist I worked with who asked me to make eye contact, and it was incredibly meaningful because I had a hard time doing that, just because it brought up a lot of weird and bad feelings for me, and not because of her as the person, but because of my past. And so, depending on somebody's vibe or what we're talking about, eye contact can be difficult and also important, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you start over analyzing, like, how much eye contact's comfortable? Am I staring them down? Do they think I'm a weirdo?
Absolutely. And I think, often neurodivergent people do struggle with, interpersonal relationships, and kind of understanding neurotypicals, and understanding we're often perceived as being a little too brash, because we often say things directly. And
Oh, yes.
neurotypical people have a roundabout way, sometimes out of politeness, to say things. And I have lived as a neurodivergent people in a neurotypical world for 37 years, so I had quite a few years observing neurotypicals up close. And lots of the times I can fake it, but sometimes even at 37, I get taken aback by somebody being offended by what I said, and I have to, kind of go back and say, oh no, I'm sorry, that's not what I meant. I meant exactly what I said. You just perceived it through a neurotypical lens as being too harsh.
Sure.
I didn't mean it in a harsh way. I meant it in the exact way I said it. And so, on one hand, right, assuming the best intent is, I think, always the best policy. But on the other hand, as a neurodivergent people, we often have to kind of study what the heck is it that the neurotypical people want from us, or why. I remember, especially as a teenager, I always knew I said something wrong when people's expression change. One of the things that ADHD people, I think, are very good at is taking the temperature. I can walk into a room and feel what the mood is, and I can always tell when somebody's mood changes. And I can tell that it's because I said something. I can't always tell why is it. So I can tell that, like, oops, that was the wrong thing to say. But I often struggle with deciphering why was it the wrong thing to say. And that is another thing that is really exhausting in the workplace, right? Because then you have to go talk to your boss and have to apologize to your coworkers because you said something in a direct way and they perceived it as an attack. And now you're not even understanding why you're being punished. You just know that people are mad. And so that's where lots of I think that's where lots of neurodivergent people anxiety over social interaction comes in.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a great call out too, because thinking of other neurodivergent people, especially with autism, because autism is a spectrum and can show up in many different ways. But a lot of times it's very similar that autistic people struggle socially because they are not sure what to say or don't know the social norms. And then they're having to think and work through that. And that's really difficult, right? And I think that's where neurodivergence and being more accepting and normalizing that not everybody's the same, right? And assuming positive intent, this may have offended me, but then think, why am I offended? Was this meant in just a way that was informative and not like a personal attack, right? And I know I've had several of those conversations in the workplace because, especially in corporate workspaces, sometimes your entire ability to get promoted is based on how others perceive you. I remember one time I was trying to get like a exceeds expectation end of year rating. And I remember my boss coming to me and saying, hey, you need to be careful, like what you're saying to people when they're trying to engage you in conversation. And it was another manager that was above me. And I just happened to be busy and kind of blew them off just because I was busy. It was nothing personal, but that upset them. And therefore, part of their perception of me was that I wasn't really people engaged or people focused, and being a team leader or team manager, that's important. And so it's really frustrating, even from a neurotypical standpoint, because I had no negative intent there, but then I'm trying to manage all these perceptions, and that's exhausting. And then I can't imagine how amplified that is being neurodivergent, right?
Yeah. And one thing I want to point out is ADHD and autism have 80% symptom overlap. So lots of the things that I experience as an ADHD person, I think lots of the things people with autism can also relate to. And yeah, assuming positive intent is always great, but also like communication.
Hell yeah.
Just say it. I always tell my boss, like, I'm never, I'm not too sensitive. I'm hard to offend. I just want to hear if I offend somebody, or what is it somebody has a problem with. And I don't know why. Maybe it's because I have ADHD and I just literally don't know why. But it feels quite often like people just don't want to have direct conversations about, because I worked best that way. So if you're like, Ellie, X, Y, and Z, you're not doing well enough, or Ellie, when you say that, this is what I hear, then I'm able to exactly identify what's wrong and be like, oh yeah, I can fix that. That's not a problem. But when I don't know, then I can't fix it.
Sure.
And that is really difficult for me. And again, it might be because I have ADHD that I just much prefer, in fact, now that I'm saying it out loud, it probably is because I have ADHD. I prefer directness. I prefer when people are direct with me. And, I don't like when people are mean to me, but I think being straightforward goes a long way for me to be able to realize, something I'm doing is not the best, but the guessing game is impossible.
I'm glad you called that out for a couple reasons. First, over my 13-year career in a financial services industry, I had many bosses, many teams. And there was one particular manager that I was, for lack of a better word, stuck with for a year that I will, as of today, say is the worst boss I've ever had, because he was wishy-washy. He would tell me one thing, and then like our quarterly or mid-year review will come around and say something completely different. Mm-hmm. And I felt like I was walking on eggshells constantly, and it caused anxiety, depression. I was burnt out because I was constantly trying to play this game, trying to figure out what it is my boss needed. And then, sometimes it was a good review, sometimes it was a bad review, and I just felt like I could never win. And I giggled a little bit when you're talking about directness, because I think from my perspective, being 33, I grew up in high school where we transitioned from not having cell phones as kids to smartphones being a part of our lives as adults. And we saw both the before and after. Mm-hmm. Millennials are a very unique generation with that. And I've coached high schoolers within the last 5 years, and they've grown up entirely their adult life with smartphones. And one of the trends I noticed, and I've talked to many teachers about this who are friends of mine, is that there's, both in adults and kids, there's a lack of critical thinking skills and conflict resolution, mm-hmm. because it's so easy to hide behind a phone now and just have a text message and not have to have interpersonal conversations face to face. And so I'll give you a great example. Is we were on a week-long trip to in this case, Philadelphia, but we did them many times when I was in high school. We went to Washington, D.C. So we rode on the bus with 40 people, and you made your stops and you stayed the night. And I remember it being really fun when we were kids. I think most folks probably did some kind of school trip like that growing up. And when we would go on these trips, we sat on the bus and we'd talk to our friends, and it was a really social time. And I noticed the kids were literally sitting right next to each other, texting, mm-hmm. in the same seat.
Yeah.
And so they were using Snapchat and then texting the person at the front of the bus. And and literally on our particular trip, it became this huge ordeal because there was drama. I know that's not surprising with teenagers. But it got misconstrued because behind electronic communication, there's no body language, there's no tone, and it's hard to tell intent. And it became this thing where the entire group became involved, and the instructors had to bring them together and be like, get your crap together or we're going back home. Mm-hmm. And the very last day of the trip, they put their phones away because they wanted to go to the amusement park instead of going home. And they actually socialized and interacted with each other. And they had such a good time. Better communication. They were having fun. They weren't as cliquey. And humans are social creatures. And even I see this with adults. We get so consumed with electronic media or not wanting to face that conflict, whether that's because of our personal mental health, or maybe we're just so used to being able to hide behind electronic communication that we're not direct anymore. And so a critical skill for humankind and for us to exist in the future is us to continue to have those critical thinking and conflict resolution skills, and that requires being face to face. And I don't think that's just strictly neurodivergence, but I do think that's a great call out, and that's my soapbox.
No, I mean, boy, what a double-edged sword smartphones and connectivity and social media is. Um, not only not only from the point of view of, oh, it is so much harder to communicate intent and body language and all of those other things that really make up more of our communication styles than language itself, but also for people with ADHD, our dopamine regulation is kind of broken, for lack of a better term. So we often engaged in dopamine seeking behaviors. And boy, social media and smartphones aren't those great for that like really quick hit. But overall, it's detrimental to your experience as a human. And that's something we've been talking about with my boyfriend who also has ADHD, about how to get together and avoid the screens, right?
Sure.
It's so easy to, because as an ADHD person, I've never had a question come into my brain that I didn't immediately need to research the answer to. And I don't know what we did before smartphones, but like having Google in my pocket has been clutch. But it's not a great habit. The negative part of, like, if I don't Google it now, I will forget it. Object permanence is another huge thing for me. If I don't see it, if another thought comes in, that old thought is now dead. RIP. I will never get it back. But being able to just sit and talk to each other, and also to be bored. I think the art of being bored is slowly becoming lost. And that's where your brain can be creative.
Oh, yeah.
When you don't have those external stimuli being served to you, it's such an important thing. And as me and my boyfriend are talking about potentially having children, we both come from long ADHD history, clans with long ADHD history. There is no chance. ADHD is genetic. There's very little chance that we will have together a neurotypical child. Well, that would be a miracle on its own. So I think we're talking about a lot more about parenting a neurodivergent child, which is something that is a little different than being a neurodivergent adult. Having a child that you're teaching about the world, that looks completely foreign to them, a child that has tendencies to seek out dopamine everywhere, and that has tendencies to get overstimulated quickly, as toddlers are already prone to.
Oh yeah.
I view that as a little bit of a challenge, but also I think being able to teach your children that the world's outside of their electronic devices is more important. I know it's really hard, and I'm not judging any parents, because parenting is super hard, and parenting in a culture that doesn't value parental input and still requires you to parent like you don't have a job and work like you don't have a children is really, really hard.
Absolutely.
But being able to teach your child to put the device down, I think, is very important. I think as you said, us as millennials, we were the last ones to grow up without an electronic device in our pocket. And this generation, that's all they did. And I think that the pendulum is kind of swinging back a little bit, where more and more parents are realizing that it could be a helpful tool, but it also is very dangerous. The amount of time and the amount of access children have through those devices. So I think lots of parents are realizing that they have to pull back.
Absolutely. I agree 100%. And I've seen a wide range of parenting where, some parents limit the screen time. Some parents are just overwhelmed and they're a single parent and the screen time saves them from, gives them some sanity back in their life. Like it's a very difficult thing to manage because I know as an adult, I have trouble managing my screen time. I could not imagine trying to manage screen time for a child, right? And so to that degree, like I don't judge anybody who has screen time. It was just an observation without the screens. The interaction was completely different. And I do think there's a lot of content being put out now, especially around mental health and our nervous systems and just, in general about how do we get away from the screen time. And I'm actually listening to this book called The Myth of Normal by Gabor Mate. And one of the things in the last chapter I listened to that they were talking about is there are literal companies that exist with psychologists and neuropsychologists to create applications and games that all they do is create dopamine effects to keep people hooked on the apps or keep people hooked on the phone or whatever. And when you literally have companies out there targeting everybody to do this, and that's their entire job is to biohack our biology to, keep giving us those dopamine hits so they make more money and blah, 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 blah.
Yep.
It's scary because if you're not cognizant of that being a thing, you get sucked into it, right? And I think we're all guilty of it. We've all sat on our phone playing a game on TikTok, Instagram, whatever. And there's value on both sides, but also there's dangers, right?
Yep.
So I think everything in moderation, and we've said this on this podcast before, it's hard, but finding different ways, to your point, to engage, I think is great. And I know people think I'm crazy for quote unquote running.
Yeah.
But the reality is I tell people I do it because I can be outside and I just go outside. Sometimes I have my music in, sometimes I don't. And I just enjoy seeing the scenery and listening to the birds or just focusing on my body. And I don't check my phone. I very rarely talk to anyone. I very rarely am messing with my phone. I just let the playlist go. And it's just like a great disconnect for me. And I've noticed when I'm not doing my runs, because I'm not getting outside and some other things, I am in a much shittier mood. Because my body's not getting what it needs to disconnect. And running for me is that disconnect. It doesn't have to be for everybody.
Yeah. No, but I think that's such an important point. And for everybody, whether a neurodivergent or neurotypical, going outside, getting exercise, those two things alone, study after study after study that we have shows how important that is to your health and well-being, physical and mental. Being able to go outside, get sun and fresh air and move your body is huge. And I think especially for neurodivergent people, I think sometimes it's really hard for me when I come home from work and I'm so exhausted. Like I have a job where now, after I got diagnosed, I pretty quickly realized that corporate America was not for me, and that's why I was struggling. So I have a job where I move my body a lot and I talk to lots of people and it's very engaging and I love it. But at the end of the day, boy, I'm exhausted. But if I actually force myself and either take my dog to the park or go for a walk or do something active, I feel better.
Absolutely.
And that's a huge way of regulating your nervous system too, is being outside and just being. Even though sometimes it's hard, I think, for neurodivergent people with racing thoughts. If I'm not medicated, my brain is just like having a party in there. And it's constant thoughts going back and forth. But that's also something we can make better by practice, right? Practicing mindfulness, super hard for anybody, so hard for neurodivergent people. Because I've noticed this trend of neurodivergent people referring to their brain as separate from themselves. And sometimes that's what it feels like. It feels like your brain has a brain of its own, and it's just like on something. Sometimes I have a thought and I literally stop myself and go, what are you doing? Why are you bringing these things up? This happened in middle school, okay? Let's not. I'll wake up in the middle of the night with having like a really vivid dream and go, what are you doing there? We're supposed to be resting. Why are you making up scary movies? Stop it. But being able to like go outside and move your body, it's super important and super important, I think, for ADHD people to get exercise. Because now that you have an electronic device connected to the whole world, literally in your pocket and everywhere in your house, it's so easy to get that dopamine from the palm of your hand. But it's also out there. You can also do things. And one other thing I have found, other than exercise, which I think is really important, one other thing I have found really, really important in my life is art. Making art and doing something creative. It doesn't have to be good. I'm not good at making any art, but doing something creative really, I don't know exactly what the science behind it is. I just can tell you that my brain really likes it. It feels good. It feels right. And it doesn't have to be anything you do, I think the geek culture, right? It's like everything you do, you have to go on Etsy and sell, and you have to, have 20 gigs and always be making money. I think not doing that. I think taking walks with no purpose, not going anywhere, and making art with no purpose, letting your brain be creative and be in the moment. I think that is one thing that has really helped my brain feel better, feel like it's not, constantly full of electricity.
No, I think that's a great call out too, because for a couple reasons. I probably could say that phrase all day, but there was a debate I was having with some colleagues about artificial intelligence, and during the Writers Screen Guild strike, people were talking about AI taking existing creative work to create new content while the writers were on strike. And one, that's not okay. Like, that's not true creativity. You're just hacking what other people had, right? That's all the AI is doing is taking what's already existed. But there's a phrase I read somewhere that said the purpose of AI or computers or, being more efficient as things is, we want the AI or the computers and robots to help us do laundry and clean the dishes so we have more time to be creative, not the other way around. We don't want the AI and computers and robots to be creative so I can spend time doing laundry and cooking and doing dishes. And I think that comparison is great because over the last century, as technology has advanced and made our lives easier, realistically, what that should be doing is giving us more time to be creative, which is what humans do best. That's what makes us unique. And not, spend more time on mundane daily tasks.
Absolutely.
And I think it's difficult because we're living through this age. Things are changing so rapidly. It's hard to kind of like get a grasp of it. But even outside the context of AI and looking at just the mental health space and psychology, there is tons of research around things like music therapy and art therapy and all these other things, because creativity is a core part of being human and what, makes us unique, and it's therapeutic in its own ways. And I think ideally in a perfect world, we'd all love to, express our creativity as our full-time job and just be. It's part of the reason I started this podcast is it's my way to be creative, and I don't get paid to do this. I'm doing this for fun because I'm passionate about this subject, but it gives me purpose outside of my day-to-day job, which is, cool and, pays me well and I like the people, but it's not what I'm passionate about, and finding space to be creative. For me, that's the podcast or, making art. I was actually looking around the living room. There's a couple like fartsy art stuff that we did as a group, or at this paint and sips, but I hung it up because it gives me joy and there's a memory behind it. And I think you're hit the nail on the head with that one.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that if I could talk to 20-year-old Ellie and tell her something, it would be things don't have to be perfect and your job will never love you back. Yeah, we would all love the paradigm where we all do super creative things and things that fulfill us. But at the end of the day, and I love my job. Don't get me wrong. I love my job. I have found something that I'm very passionate about, and healthcare is a place where I now see I was always meant to be. I am a caregiver by nature, and to be able to do that for work is amazing for me. But at the end of the day, that's not the only place where I need to seek fulfillment. I have discovered as an adult past my 20s that fulfillment doesn't only come from a place that makes you money and pays your bills.
Love that.
It's great if that also includes fulfillment, but at the end of the day, there are people who work mundane jobs that have fulfilling lives. And there are people that work in fulfilling careers that don't have fulfilling lives. Seeking that humanity elsewhere is super important.
I wholeheartedly agree. So with that being said, I think we had a very dynamic discussion about neurodivergence. I think it's super important to normalize a lot of what we talked about today with just allowing space for people to be different, assuming positive intent, and also understanding that, it's can be difficult, especially to your point, like if you're not diagnosed as ADHD and you're not neurodivergent, you might not know what's going on. But even if you are, it's still difficult because the way we live and work, isn't made for non-neurotypical people or neurodivergent people. So with that being said, is there anything else you'd like to share with us today, Ellie?
Yes. I would say just remember we're all work in progress, and language that you use towards yourself. I've said this to one of my coworkers, and I've been thinking about it since. She was kind of hard on herself because something went wrong, and she was saying, "I'm so dumb." And I looked at her and I said, "Would you say this to me if I made a mistake?" So when you talk to yourself, think about, would you say this to your good friend? Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you being authentic and sharing with us. I know it's tough to share our own personal perspective and our struggles sometimes. But you did it in such a way that I find it highly interesting and allowed a couple soapboxes there. So take what you learned today, go normalize it. And this has been It's Sensitive with Alex
and Ellie.
And have a great week.